The rain came down in sheets on the morning of May 2nd, 1945, turning the dirt roads outside Berchtesgaden into rivers of mud. The sky hung low and grey, pressing down on the mountains like a lid on a pot about to boil over. Nurse Margarete Hoffman stood in a long line of women, hands clasped in front of her, water dripping from the edge of her wool coat. Around her, nearly 60 German nurses waited in silence, their Red Cross armbands soaked through, their faces blank with exhaustion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They had been walking for 3 days since leaving the hospital at Bad Reichenhall. The Wehrmacht had abandoned them, without supplies, without transport, without orders. The front had collapsed so quickly that no one knew who was in charge anymore. All they knew was that the Americans were coming, and everyone said the same thing: don't let them catch you alive. Marguerite's feet ached. Her boots were worn through at the heels, and every step sent a jolt of pain up her calves. But she kept her expression steady, the way she'd been trained. A nurse does not complain. A nurse does not show weakness. A nurse serves until there is no one left to serve. Ahead of her in the line, a younger woman named Elsa whispered, "Do you think they'll shoot us here, or take us somewhere first?" Margarete didn't answer. She had stopped guessing days ago. The American soldiers appeared like shadows through the rain. Their uniforms were dark with water, their helmets slick and gleaming. They moved with a kind of tired efficiency, rifles slung over their shoulders, voices low and clipped. One of them, a sergeant with a square jaw and mud-caked boots, walked down the line, scanning faces without expression. When he reached Margarete, he stopped. His eyes moved from her face to the Red Cross patch on her sleeve, then back again. "Your nurses?" he asked in rough German. The sergeant turned and called over his shoulder to another soldier, a translator. The man jogged over, his boots splashing in the puddles. "He wants to know if any of you are injured," the translator said. Margarete glanced down the line. A few women had bandages visible beneath their coats. Others stood with their weight shifted to one leg, clearly favouring an injury. But no one spoke. The sergeant frowned. He said something to the translator, who nodded, and then addressed the group more loudly. "You will be taken to a holding area. Medical personnel will examine you. Do not resist. Do not run." The words landed like stones. Holding area. Examination. The nurses exchanged glances, brief and sharp. Everyone knew what those words could mean. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Elsa's breathing quickened beside Margarete. "They're going to interrogate us," she whispered. "They'll want to know what we did during the war." Margarete kept her voice low. "Then we tell them the truth. We were nurses. We treated soldiers. And if they don't believe us?" Margarete didn't have an answer for that. The line began to move. The soldiers directed them toward a convoy of trucks parked along the muddy road. The trucks were American-made, massive and utilitarian, their canvas tops sagging under the weight of the rain. One by one, the nurses climbed into the back, hands gripping the wet metal railings, boots slipping on the slick floor. Margarete found a spot near the corner and sat down on the rough wooden bench. The truck smelled of diesel and damp canvas. Around her, the other women sat in silence, faces pale, eyes fixed on the floor or the road disappearing behind them. The engine roared to life, and the convoy lurched forward. The rain drummed against the canvas roof, a relentless rhythm that matched the pounding in Margarete's chest. She thought about the hospital at Bad Reichenhall. She thought about the soldiers she had treated there, German boys with shattered limbs and hollow eyes. She thought about the orders she had been given. Prioritize the wounded who can return to the front. Let the others go. She had tried to follow those orders. But when a 19-year-old with a bullet in his lung looked up at her and asked if he was going to die, she couldn't turn away. She had given him morphine, even though the supply was low. She had held his hand until his breathing stopped. Was that a crime? Would the Americans see it that way? The truck hit a pothole, and the women jolted forward. Someone cried out, then quickly stifled the sound. Fear hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. After what felt like hours, the convoy slowed. The canvas flap at the back of the truck was pulled aside, and a soldier gestured for them to get out. Margarete climbed down carefully, her legs stiff and aching. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the ground was still a mess of mud and gravel. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. They were in a small valley surrounded by pine trees. In the center of the clearing stood a cluster of military tents, their sides bulging from the wind. American flags hung limp and wet from makeshift poles. Soldiers moved between the tents, carrying crates and equipment, their voices muffled by the rain. But what caught Margarete's attention was the largest tent at the far end of the clearing. It was different from the others, taller, with reinforced supports and a Red Cross flag hanging above the entrance. A hospital tent. Elsa grabbed Margarete's arm. "What is that?" Margarete stared at the tent, her mind struggling to make sense of it. "A hospital. Here." "For them?" A voice called out in German, and the nurses turned. An American officer stood near the entrance to the tent, flanked by two medics in white coats. He was older than the soldiers who had escorted them, maybe in his 40s, with grey streaks in his hair and deep lines around his eyes. "My name is Captain Lawrence," he said in clear, careful German. "You have been brought here for medical evaluation and treatment. You will be examined, given food and clean water, and assigned quarters. You are not prisoners. You are patients." The words didn't register at first. Margarete heard them, but they didn't fit with anything she had been told to expect. Patients, not prisoners. One of the older nurses, a woman named Hilda with a scarred cheek and iron-grey hair, stepped forward. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Why would you help us?" Captain Lawrence met her gaze without flinching. "Because you're nurses, and because the war is over." The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. Margarete stood near the entrance to the hospital tent, trying to reconcile what she was, seeing with what she had been taught to believe. The tent was enormous, easily large enough to hold 50 beds. Inside, she could see rows of cots covered with clean white sheets. Medical equipment hung from hooks along the support beams, stethoscopes, blood pressure cuffs, surgical kits. The smell of antiseptic drifted out into the damp air, sharp and familiar. It looked like a real hospital, not a makeshift station, not a punishment facility, a hospital. Elsa stood beside her, eyes wide. "They built this for us?" Margarete didn't answer. She was too busy trying to understand why. Captain Lawrence gestured toward the tent. "We'll begin with the most critically injured. If you have wounds that need immediate attention, step forward now." A few women moved hesitantly toward the front of the group. One had a deep gash on her forearm, poorly bandaged with torn cloth. Another limped heavily, her ankle swollen to twice its normal size. A third cradled her hand against her chest, fingers bent at an unnatural angle. The medics stepped forward, calm and efficient, guiding the injured women into the tent. No shouting, no rough handling, just steady, practiced care. Margarete watched them disappear inside, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Relief? Disbelief? Fear that this was all some kind of trap? Hilda moved closer to her, arms crossed. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "They should hate us." Margarete nodded slowly. They should. So why don't they? Margarete had no answer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The examination process began an hour later. The nurses were divided into groups of 10 and led into the tent one group at a time. Margarete found herself in the third group, along with Elsa and a handful of others she didn't know well. Inside, the tent was warmer than she expected. A portable heater hummed in the portable corner, pushing out waves of dry heat that cut through the dampness. The light was bright, almost harsh, coming from electric lamps strung along the ceiling. An American medic approached, clipboard in hand. He was young, maybe 25, with sandy hair and freckles across his nose. He looked more like a farmhand than a soldier. "Name?" he asked in halting German. "Margarete Hoffman." He wrote it down. "Age? 32. Medical training? Certified Red Cross nurse. 4 years of service." He nodded, making notes. Then he looked up at her, his expression neutral. "Any injuries?" Margarete hesitated. She had a persistent cough that had started weeks ago, probably from sleeping in damp conditions. Her hands were raw from frostbite, and she hadn't had a full meal in nearly a week. But she didn't know if admitting weakness would be used against her. The medic seemed to sense her hesitation. "We're not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "We just need to know if you need help." Something in his tone made her believe him. "I have a cough," she said finally, "and frostbite on my hands." He nodded again, writing quickly. "We'll take a look at both. Please sit." She sat on the edge of a cot, hands folded in her lap. The medic set down his clipboard and pulled out a stethoscope. "Deep breath," he said. She inhaled slowly, feeling the cold metal of the stethoscope against her back through the thin fabric of her blouse. Again. She breathed in again. The medic listened carefully, then stepped back. "Sounds like mild bronchitis. We'll give you medication for that." He picked up her hands, examining the reddened skin and cracked fingertips. "This will need ointment and bandaging. We'll take care of it." Margarete stared at him. "Why are you doing this?" The medic looked up, surprised by the question. "Doing what?" "Helping us. Treating us like we matter." He set her hands down gently and met her eyes. "Because you do." The simplicity of the answer left her, speechless. Over the next few hours, Margarete watched as the American medics worked their way through the group. They treated wounds, distributed medicine, handed out clean bandages and ointments. They didn't ask about the war. They didn't interrogate. They didn't accuse. They just treated the nurses like patients. By the time Margarete left the tent, her hands were wrapped in clean white gauze, and she had a small bottle of cough syrup tucked into her coat pocket. The rain had stopped, and the evening light was breaking through the clouds, painting the valley in shades of gold and grey. Elsa walked beside her, silent and pale. Finally, she spoke. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "We were enemies. We served the Reich. Why don't they punish us?" Margarete looked toward the hospital tent, where more nurses were still being examined. "I don't know," she said. "But maybe they see us as something other than enemies." "What, then?" Margarete thought for a long moment. "Maybe they see us as people who were caught in the same war they were." Elsa didn't respond, but her expression shifted slightly, as if she was beginning to believe it might be true. That night, the nurses were assigned to sleeping quarters in a series of smaller tents near the edge of the clearing. The tents were simple but clean, with cots and blankets that smelled faintly of soap. It was more comfort than Margarete had known in months. She lay on her cot, staring up at the canvas ceiling, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into night. Somewhere in the distance, a soldier was playing a harmonica, the notes drifting soft and mournful through the trees. Beside her, Elsa whispered into the darkness, "Do you think they'll let us go?" Margarete didn't know. She didn't know what came next, or what the Americans planned to do with them, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the constant weight of fear pressing down on her chest. "I think," she said slowly, "that, whatever happens, we'll face it as nurses, not as enemies." Elsa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I hope you're right." Margarete closed her eyes, feeling the exhaustion settle into her bones. Outside, the harmonica continued to play, and the night wrapped itself around the camp like a blanket. Morning came with birdsong, a sound so ordinary it felt almost wrong. Margarete woke to sunlight filtering through the tent canvas, warm and golden, painting soft patterns across the blankets. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the memories returned, the convoy, the hospital tent, the American medic's hands carefully wrapping her frostbitten fingers. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the others. Around her, the nurses still slept, their breathing quiet and even. It was the first peaceful sleep most of them had known in months. Outside, the camp was already stirring. Margarete could hear the clatter of metal pots, the low murmur of voices, the rhythmic thud of boots on damp ground. She pulled on her coat and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The valley looked different in daylight. The mountains rose sharp and green against a pale blue sky. The mud from yesterday's rain was already beginning to dry, leaving the ground patchy and uneven. Smoke rose from several cooking fires near the center of the camp, carrying the smell of coffee and something else, something she couldn't quite identify. Food. Her stomach clenched with sudden hunger. She hadn't realized how empty she was until the smell hit her. A voice called out in German, and she turned. Captain Lawrence stood near the hospital tent, flanked by the same medics from yesterday. He gestured toward a long table that had been set up near the cooking fires. "Breakfast is ready," he called. "Please, come eat." The nurses emerged from their tents slowly, cautiously, like animals testing unfamiliar ground. They moved toward the table in small clusters, eyes scanning the Americans for signs of hostility or deceit. But there was none. The table was covered with metal trays filled with food: scrambled eggs, bread, porridge, tinned fruit. It wasn't a feast, but it was more than any of them had seen in weeks. American soldiers stood behind the table, serving portions onto metal plates without comment or judgment. Margarete took a plate and held it out. A young soldier, barely out of his teens, spooned eggs and porridge onto it, then added a thick slice of bread. "Coffee?" he asked, in broken German. She nodded, and he poured a cup from a large pot, the liquid steaming in the cool air. She found a spot on a wooden bench and sat down, plate balanced on her knees. The first bite of eggs was almost overwhelming, warm, seasoned with salt and pepper, real and solid. She forced herself to eat slowly, but her body wanted to devour everything at once. Elsa sat down beside her, eyes fixed on her own plate with something close to disbelief. "They're feeding us," she whispered. "Like we're guests." Hilda, the older nurse with the scarred cheek, sat across from them. She chewed slowly, her expression hard and unreadable. "Don't let your guard down," she said quietly. "This could still be a tactic." "A tactic for what?" Elsa asked. "To make us compliant, to extract information, to feed us?" Margarete interrupted gently. "That seems like a complicated way to interrogate someone." Hilda's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Around them, the other nurses ate in silence, their faces a mixture of relief, confusion, and suspicion. Years of propaganda didn't vanish with a single meal. But something was shifting, slowly, like ice beginning to crack. After breakfast, Captain Lawrence gathered the nurses near the hospital tent. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression serious but not unkind. "We need to discuss what happens next," he said in careful German. "The war is over. Germany has surrendered. But the process of rebuilding will take time." A murmur rippled through the group. Surrendered. The word felt heavy. "Final," Lawrence continued. "You are medical personnel. You have skills that are desperately needed. We are prepared to offer you a choice." The nurses exchanged glances. A choice. That word felt almost foreign. "You can remain here, under American supervision, and work in this hospital. We will continue to treat you as patients until you are fully recovered, and then you may choose to assist with medical operations in the region. Or," he paused, "you can be transferred to a civilian camp and wait for repatriation." The silence that followed was thick with uncertainty. Hilda stepped forward. "And if we choose to work? What does that make us?" Lawrence met her gaze steadily. "It makes you nurses. Nothing more, nothing less." "But we served the Reich," another woman said, her voice trembling. "We treated German soldiers." "You treated the wounded," Lawrence interrupted, his tone firm but not harsh. "That is what nurses do. We do not punish people for performing medical care." Margarete felt something tighten in her chest. For years, she had been told that the Allies were ruthless, that they would show no mercy to anyone who had served Germany. She had believed it because she had no reason not to. The propaganda had been everywhere, woven into every aspect of daily life. But here was an American officer, standing in front of 60 German nurses, offering them not punishment but partnership. It didn't make sense. Or rather, it made sense in a way that shattered everything she thought she knew. The nurses spent the rest of the morning in small groups, debating the offer. Some were eager to accept, desperate for purpose and stability. Others were deeply suspicious, convinced it was a trap. Still, others simply didn't know what to think. Margarete found herself walking the perimeter of the camp, trying to clear her head. The valley was quiet except for the occasional call of a bird or the distant sound of a truck engine. She passed American soldiers, going about their work, repairing equipment, organizing supplies, writing letters home. They glanced at her as she passed, but none of them stopped her or questioned her presence. She was free to walk, free to think, free to choose. When was the last time she had felt that? She found a fallen log near the edge of the tree line and sat down, staring out at the mountains. The peaks were still capped with snow, brilliant white against the blue sky, beautiful and indifferent. Footsteps approached, and she turned to see Captain Lawrence walking toward her. He stopped a respectful distance away. "May I sit?" he asked. She nodded. He sat down with a quiet sigh, removing his cap and running a hand through his greying hair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Margarete broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" Lawrence looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Doing what, specifically?" "All of it. The hospital, the food, choice. We were your enemies." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains. Then he said, "I've been a doctor for 20 years. I've treated men from every side of this war, Americans, British, Germans, even Russians once. And you know what I've learned?" She waited. "Everyone bleeds the same color. Everyone feels pain the same way. And everyone deserves care when they're suffering." Margarete looked down at her bandaged hands. "In Germany, we were taught that compassion was weakness, that mercy for the enemy was betrayal." "I know," Lawrence said quietly. "We were taught something similar. that Germans were monsters, that you couldn't be reasoned with or shown kindness. But I've met too many German soldiers and nurses and civilians to believe that anymore. Then, what do you believe? He turned to look at her, his eyes tired but clear. I believe that war turns people into symbols, enemies, threats, numbers on a casualty report. But when the fighting stops, we have to remember that we're all just people trying to survive. Marguerite felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. I don't know if I can accept this, she said quietly. After everything we were told, everything we believed, it feels like betraying something. Betraying what? Lawrence asked gently. She struggled to find the words. The soldiers I treated, the ones who died believing they were protecting their country. If I accept help from the people who killed them, then you're honoring their humanity by refusing to perpetuate the hatred that got them killed in the first place. The words hit her like a physical blow. She sat in silence, letting them sink in. Lawrence stood slowly, replacing his cap. You don't have to decide today, he said. Take the time you need. But remember, choosing to heal isn't betrayal. It's what you were trained to do. He walked back toward the camp, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. That evening, the nurses gathered in the largest tent for what Captain Lawrence called a briefing. The tent was crowded but not uncomfortable. Someone had set up rows of wooden benches, and the medics had distributed blankets to ward off the evening chill. Lawrence stood at the front, a map spread out on a table beside him. He waited until everyone was settled before speaking. I want to be completely transparent with you, he said. The situation in Germany right now is chaotic. There are millions of displaced people, destroyed cities, overwhelmed hospitals. The need for medical personnel is desperate. He gestured to the map, which showed the surrounding region marked with red circles. These are areas where field hospitals have been established. Most are operating at partial capacity because we simply don't have enough staff. If you choose to work with us, you would be assigned to one of these facilities. A nurse near the front raised her hand tentatively. And our status? Would we be prisoners? No, Lawrence said firmly. You would be civilian medical workers under Allied supervision. You would receive the same rations as our staff, the same accommodations, and the same protections under international law. Hilda spoke up from the back. And what about after? When the hospitals are no longer needed? Then you'll be released to return home, assuming you have homes to return to. His expression softened. I won't lie to you. Germany has been devastated. Many of you may find that the places you came from no longer exist, but we will help you locate family members and provide support for reintegration. The tent fell silent. The reality of what he was describing, the scale of the destruction, the uncertainty of the future settled over them like a heavy blanket. But there was something else in that silence too, a fragile, tentative hope. Later that night, Marguerite lay in her cot, listening to the quiet breathing of the women around her. Elsa was asleep, her face peaceful, for the first time since they'd been captured. Hilda lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her expression unreadable. Margaret closed her eyes and thought about the hospital at Bad Reichenhall. She thought about the soldiers she had treated there, the ones who had died in her arms, calling for mothers and wives and God. She thought about the orders she had been given and the ones she had quietly disobeyed. She had become a nurse because she wanted to help people. That was the simple truth at the core of everything. The war had tried to complicate that truth, to twist it into something about loyalty and duty and sacrifice for the fatherland. But Captain Lawrence was right. In the end, it was still just about helping people. She opened her eyes and stared at the canvas ceiling, feeling a decision crystallize in her mind. Tomorrow, she would tell Captain Lawrence that she would stay. She would work in one of those field hospitals. She would use her training to help whoever needed it, regardless of which flag they had fought under. It wouldn't erase the past. It wouldn't bring back the soldiers who had died. But it was the only way forward she could see. Beside her, Hilda's voice drifted through the darkness. "Are you going to accept his offer?" Margarete turned her head. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I'm a nurse. And people need help." Hilda was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I think I will too." Margarete smiled faintly in the darkness. "Good. But I'm not doing it for them," Hilda added quickly. "I'm doing it because I need to remember who I was before all of this. That's reason enough." Outside, the night was still and clear. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The sound of normal life, struggling to reassert itself in a broken world. The field hospital at Traunstein was housed in what had once been a Catholic school. The building stood at the edge of town, its yellow plaster walls pockmarked with shrapnel scars, its windows patched with boards, canvas. But inside, the Americans had transformed the classrooms into wards, the gymnasium into an operating theatre, and the cafeteria into a supply depot. Margarete arrived on a grey morning in mid-May, along with 12 other German nurses who had accepted Captain Lawrence's offer. They travelled in the back of an American truck, watching the ruined countryside roll past in silence. Every town they passed looked the same. Burned-out buildings, cratered streets, people moving through the rubble with the slow, mechanical movements of exhaustion. The war was over, but its aftermath stretched out like an endless road. When they arrived at the hospital, they were met by Major Helen Cartwright, the head of nursing operations. She was a tall woman in her late 30s, with sharp features and grey eyes that missed nothing. She wore an American Army nurse's uniform, crisp and immaculate, despite the chaos around her. She looked at the German nurses with an expression that was neither warm nor hostile, just evaluating. "I'm told you have experience," she said in English, which one of the American medics translated into German. "We'll see. Right now, I need bodies with training. I don't have time for politics or sentiment. If you can work, you'll work. If you can't, you'll be reassigned." The nurses nodded. Major Cartwright gestured toward the building. "Ward assignments will be posted in the main hall. You'll work 8-hour shifts, rotating between day and night duty. Meals are provided in the staff canteen." Questions? No one spoke. Good. Get to work. Margarete was assigned to Ward 3, a long room that had once been a chemistry classroom. The periodic table still hung on one wall, faded and torn. 30 beds lined the room in 2 rows, each occupied by a patient in various states of injury and illness. What struck her immediately was the mix of people. German soldiers lay beside Polish refugees. American GIs recovered next to former Wehrmacht officers. A French civilian with a broken leg occupied the bed next to a teenage boy from the Volkssturm, barely 15, with a shattered arm. The war had tried to keep these people separate, to define them as enemies. But here, in this makeshift hospital, they were just patients, all of them broken, all of them human. An American nurse named Lieutenant Patricia Hayes approached Margarete with a clipboard. She was young, maybe 25, with red hair pulled back in a tight bun and freckles across her nose. "You're Hoffman?" she asked in halting German. "Yes." Patricia switched to English, speaking slowly so the translator could keep up. "I'll show you the routine. We do rounds every 2 hours. Check vitals, change bandages, distribute medications. Standard procedure." Margarete nodded, falling into step beside her. They moved from bed to bed, Patricia explaining each patient's condition with clinical efficiency. A Polish man with pneumonia, a German soldier recovering from surgery to remove shrapnel from his abdomen, an American corporal with severe burns on his hands and face. When they reached the American corporal, Patricia paused. "This is Corporal Jensen. 3rd-degree burns from a vehicle fire. He's been here 2 weeks. Margarete looked down at the young man. His face was wrapped in bandages, only his eyes and mouth visible. His breathing was shallow and laboured. Patricia handed Margarete a tube of ointment. "Apply this to the exposed areas. Gently." Margarete took the tube, her hands trembling slightly. This was an American soldier, a man who had fought against her country, who might have killed German soldiers, a man she had been taught to see as the enemy. But when she looked at him, all she saw was pain. She applied the ointment carefully, her touch as gentle as if he were her own brother. The corporal winced but didn't cry out. "Thank you," he whispered in English. Margarete didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She nodded and moved to the next bed. Over the following days, Margarete fell into the rhythm of the hospital. The work was exhausting, relentless, and emotionally draining. But it was also familiar. This was what she had been trained to do. This was what made sense in a world that had lost all sense. She worked alongside American nurses like Patricia, who treated her with professional courtesy but kept an emotional distance. She worked with other German nurses like Elsa, who threw themselves into the work as if trying to atone for something they couldn't name. And she worked with patients from every nation, every background, every side of the war. One afternoon, she was changing the bandages on a German officer's leg when he grabbed her wrist suddenly. "You're German," he said, his eyes fevered and intense. "Yes," she replied calmly. "Why are you working for them?" "For the Americans." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not working for anyone. I'm working as a nurse." "We lost," he hissed. "Don't you understand? We lost everything." "Then maybe it's time to stop fighting." He stared at her for a long moment, then turned his face to the wall. The hardest moments came when she had to confront her own beliefs. One evening, she was assigned to assist in surgery. A Russian refugee had been brought in with a ruptured appendix. The man was delirious with fever, speaking in a language Margarete didn't understand. The surgeon was an American captain named Dr. Morrison, a quiet man with steady hands and a calm demeanor. He worked quickly, Patricia assisting on one side and Margarete on the other. Halfway through the procedure, Margarete's hands began to shake. She thought about everything she had been told about Russians. The propaganda posters, the speeches, the stories of atrocities. She had believed it all, or at least she had never questioned it. But here was a Russian man, unconscious and vulnerable, his life in her hands. Dr. Morrison glanced at her. "You all right, Nurse Hoffman?" She forced herself to breathe steadily. "Yes, sir. Good. Suction." She performed the task automatically, her training overriding her confusion. The surgery continued. The man survived. Later that night, she sat outside the hospital, staring up at the stars. Patricia found her there, smoking a cigarette. "Mind if I sit?" Patricia asked. Margarete shook her head. They sat in silence for a while. Then Patricia said, in slow, careful German, "First surgery with the enemy?" Margarete looked at her, surprised. "How did you know?" Patricia smiled faintly. "Because I felt the same way the first time I treated a German soldier. I kept thinking about my brother. He died in France, killed by German artillery." Margarete's chest tightened. "I'm sorry." Patricia took a drag of her cigarette. "I hated Germans. All of them. For months, I couldn't even look at a German patient without feeling sick." She paused. "But then I realized something. Hating them didn't bring my brother back. It just made me worse at my job." "So you stopped hating?" Patricia shook her head. "No. I still hate the war. I hate what it did to my brother, to all of us. But the people? She gestured toward the hospital. Most of them are just trying to survive, same as me. Margarete looked down at her hands, still wrapped in bandages from the frostbite. I don't know how to let go of what I believed. You don't let go, Patricia said quietly. You just start believing something else more. Weeks passed. The hospital continued to fill with patients, refugees, soldiers, civilians caught in the chaos of a continent trying to rebuild itself. Margarete worked until her body ached and her mind went numb. But slowly, something began to change inside her. She started to see patterns. The German soldier who shared his rations with the Polish man in the next bed, the American medic who stayed up all night with a dying Wehrmacht officer, holding his hand so he wouldn't die alone. The Russian refugee who taught Elsa a lullaby to sing to the children in the pediatric ward. Small acts of kindness, offered across the lines that the war had drawn. One morning, Major Cartwright called Margarete into her office. The room was sparse, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a map of the region on the wall. Sit, Cartwright said, her tone brisk. Margarete sat. Cartwright studied her for a moment, then said, I've been watching you work. You're good. Better than some of the American nurses I've trained. Margarete didn't know how to respond to that. I'm expanding the nursing staff, Cartwright continued. We're opening 2 more field hospitals in the region. I need experienced nurses to help run them. I'd like you to be one of them. Margarete blinked. You want me to lead a ward? I want you to help train new staff and oversee patient care. You'll still be under Allied supervision, but you'll have more autonomy. Cartwright leaned back in her chair. I don't give positions like this lightly, but you've proven you can put the work above everything else. That's what I need. Margarete felt a swell of emotion she couldn't quite name. Pride? Gratitude? Disbelief? I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes or no. I don't have time for speeches. Margarete smiled faintly. Yes, I'll do it. Cartwright nodded. Good. You start next week. On her last evening at Traunstein, Margarete walked through the wards one final time. She stopped at Corporal Jensen's bed. His bandages had been removed, revealing the scarred but healing skin beneath. He could speak now, though his voice was still rough. Nurse Hoffman, he said when he saw her. She approached, surprised he remembered her name. I heard you're leaving, he said in slow, careful German. Yes, to another hospital. He nodded. I wanted to thank you. For treating me like a person. Margarete's throat tightened. You are a person, he smiled faintly. I know that now. But I wasn't sure you did. I wasn't sure any of us did. She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, The war taught us to see enemies. But it's over now. We have to learn to see people again. Jensen nodded slowly. Yeah, I think you're right. Margarete left Traunstein on a clear June morning. The sky was bright and blue, and the air smelled of pine and wildflowers. She rode in the back of a truck with Elsa and 3 other German nurses, all of them assigned to the new hospital. As they drove through the mountains, Elsa turned to her and asked, Do you think we made the right choice? Working with them? Margarete thought about Captain Lawrence's words, about Patricia's quiet understanding, about Corporal Jensen's scarred face and grateful smile. I think, she said slowly, that we made the only choice that mattered. We chose to heal instead of hate. Elsa nodded, staring out at the passing landscape. My mother used to say that the hardest thing in the world is to forgive. Your enemy. Your mother was right. But you know what's even harder? What? Elsa looked at her, eyes bright with tears. Forgiving yourself for believing you had to be their enemy in the first place. Margarete reached over and squeezed her hand. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The new hospital was smaller than Traunstein, housed in a former monastery on the edge of a forest, but it was clean and well equipped, and the staff, a mix of American, British, and German medical personnel, worked with the same focused determination Margarete had seen everywhere. On her first day, she stood in the courtyard and looked up at the mountains rising in the distance. She thought about how far she had come, from that muddy road outside Berchtesgaden, where she had expected execution, to this place where she was trusted to heal. She thought about all the nurses who hadn't survived to see this moment, the ones who had been killed in bombings or died of disease or simply given up under the weight of despair. She thought about the propaganda she had believed, the lies she had been told, and the truth she had discovered in the quiet moments between changing bandages and checking pulses. The war had tried to teach her that compassion was weakness, that mercy was betrayal, that the enemy could never be human. But the war had been wrong, because in the end, humanity wasn't defined by flags or borders or ideologies. It was defined by the choice to see suffering and respond with care, to see a stranger and offer help, to see an enemy and choose healing over hate. That evening, as she made her rounds through the ward, she paused at the bedside of a young British soldier. He was asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful. She adjusted his blanket and checked his chart. Everything was stable. He would recover. And in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not for grand victory or vindication, not for the restoration of what had been lost, but for the simple, quiet possibility that people could learn from their worst mistakes and choose to build something better. One patient at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one choice to see humanity over hatred. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.